Howdy, and welcome to Brandi's Book Stack. Today, we're going to talk about the best books of all time, at least per Goodreads, who got it from the World Library, who got it from some noted authors. I picked this list because I thought it'd have at least some validity to it if noted authors of today said these books were worth reading. So I gave them a chance. Now, I'm also reviewing the best-selling books of all time, and I've posted the list from Goodreads that I'm going through. I'm also reading through the best-selling books of all time per Wikipedia. The lists are a little bit different, but they do have a lot of similarities, as you might expect. Today, though, we're going to go ahead and jump right into the stacks and start talking about these best books of all time. So the first one that we're going to talk about is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And you can see I have this very, very old modern library version of the complete novels of Jane Austen. This book is pretty beaten, battered, but it's held up. I can still read it. It's still very readable. Looking at Pride and Prejudice, of course, it is a bit of a romance from the Regency period, and we follow Elizabeth Bennet and her sisters as they attempt to find matrimonial bliss. And in this time frame, a woman's marriage was really more or less her career. Women couldn't work, and especially genteel women were expected to maintain a certain standard of living. And if you didn't marry within your station, that was a no-no. If you didn't marry someone who had the means to take care of you, that was a no-no because there really weren't a lot of options. So if a woman had a poor fortune, a poor dowry, then she had to marry a wealthy husband so she'd have someone to take care of her. If she didn't get married, she would be what they called left on the shelf and would have to subsist by either taking up a post as a governess, or they would subsist by staying in relatives' houses, many of whom were not real excited to have them there, or sometimes just losing their status as, aristocracy or gentle people, what have you. In this case, Elizabeth Bennet and her sisters really need to find husbands because their property of their father has been entailed, which means it can only go to male heirs. They have no brothers, so it's going to go to this cousin who's kind of an idiot, and they have to find a husband to take care of them, or they'll be reliant on this cousin, and that's not going to be a very good option. And of course, she meets the famous Mr. Darcy, and when they first meet, they don't like each other. This is sort of the OG enemies to lovers story. I'd highly recommend it. It's 5 out of 5 stars, mainly just because of the quality of Jane Austen's writing. Jane Austen just had a sparkling wit. The book reads very modern. Even today, you can see the same sort of circumstance occurring between peoples. Maybe not the differences in the women-men power dynamic, but definitely in the sort of conversations and flirting. You can still feel that sentiment today. So it's a great novel, highly recommend. And I thought it was interesting that Jane Austen was the number 1 pick on this list. She doesn't always get a lot of credit, particularly by men, because she does essentially write a romance, which aren't typically very popular with men. But I'm glad that the writing community at least has recognized her as being a good author. Because she deserves it. So, book number 2 is a book I read on my Kindle, and that is 1984 by George Orwell. Now, I have a controversial opinion here. I am not a 1984 fan. I'm not really sure I can put my finger on why I just don't like that novel. I think some of it has to do with the fact, of course, it is a very dour, depressing book. And I am a basic person. I don't like sad stories. I like happy stories. I feel like there's enough sadness and heartache in the world without adding more to it in our off time, if you will. And so 1984 just never clicked with me. I also feel like, and I would never say George Orwell was being misogynist or chauvinist in this book, but I do feel like he comes from a very masculine perspective. I feel like, like there's an overemphasis on sex that I think if a woman had written this book, it would have probably been more of an emphasis on love and the family life. And maybe that's just me. Lots of people love this book. Its influence on our modern culture can't be underestimated. I mean, I think everyone's familiar with the phrase, Big Brother is watching you. But it just, as a story, it just didn't click with me. I didn't want to pick it up and keep reading it. But I did. And for me, just my personal opinion, I gave it two stars, mainly for just the lack of enjoyment that I got out of reading it. So, the next book on my list is another one I read on my Kindle, and that is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And I will say, I had never read Dostoevsky before I read this novel. And I must say I was a bit intimidated by the idea of reading these Russian philosophical authors. If you are, concerned about that as well, and you're like, yeah, I don't know, that's probably going to be pretty heady stuff, don't be. I found it really, really enjoyable, and I felt it read very modern. Only a problem that I had with it was that the names are really long, and they're a bit hard to kind of get around for an English reader. But once you kind of slip into, okay, this is who that person is, this is who that person is, you get used to it, and it's a very enjoyable book. In this, we follow a man who is a poor college student. His family have just determined that they don't have the money to pay for his schooling anymore. And so he's very upset by this. He had a girlfriend who died. He's just really pretty depressed. And he decides that the answer to all of his woes is to maybe murder somebody. Somebody he feels doesn't have a lot of value to this world. And in his mind, he justifies this, thinking, it's for the greater good. If I get an education, look at all the contributions I could make to mankind. This woman has all this money and she's just throwing it away and wasting it. Well, throughout the course of the book, the main character, Raskolnikov, he learns it's not quite that simple. So it's a very good novel. It does have a lot of philosophical elements to it, but they're all presented through the plot and the characters and the interesting story. So I would highly recommend this one. 5 out of 5 stars for me. Don't be intimidated by the Russian authors. They are worth a read, and they're not as intimidating as you probably think. So, moving on to number 4. Number 4 is a book I think everybody has heard of. My husband argues this is not a book. He argues it is a play. And that is Hamlet by William Shakespeare. I think everyone has read Hamlet at least once in their life, unless they just, ditched out on their homework assignments when they were younger. I certainly know I read it in high school. And I will say, I loved Shakespeare even then. I have to admit it. I'm a book nerd, so I liked it. But I think a lot of people get turned off by Shakespeare because they read it before they're really too young to appreciate it. If you have tried Shakespeare in the past and you're like, oh, I don't know if that's for me, you might give it another shot. There's a lot of great versions of Shakespeare's plays where they have modern English on one side and they have Shakespearean English on the other side, and you can look at them side by side. So if something isn't really clear to you what they mean, you can look at the modern English and get the translation. And a lot of those are free online. I think you could probably find that for all of Shakespeare's plays online if you look around a little bit. And they're all available for free, of course. Mentioning all these books that are for free: Pride and Prejudice, free online; 1984, free online; Crime and Punishment, free online; Hamlet, free online. I read mine in this set of books that I have that come in these little bitty volumes that are oh so cute. And I'm just going to have to show off the collection because I think it is really neat. I got this at Barnes & Noble a number of years ago. And you can see it just says Shakespeare on the top. And then has all these little volumes, and all of the plays are listed in which volume that they're in up here. And then you can let down this little side and pull out the volume that you want and then box them up. But you don't have to carry the big, heavy whole collection like you do with some of the other collections. And I really like it for that reason. Of course, Hamlet is about the famous Prince of Denmark whose father was murdered by his brother, or Hamlet's uncle, who then turned around and married Hamlet's mother. Hamlet, of course, is not real happy about this and is trying to decide how to wreak his revenge for what has happened to him. It is a tragedy, so I mean, expect that it's going to be sad. You know, I don't like dour or sad and depressing. This one's sad and depressing, but Shakespeare's use of language is so beautiful. You know, whether to nobler to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. I mean, it sounds a whole lot better than, you know, well, should we be sad or kill ourselves? That's really what he's saying. But he says it so beautifully. And that's just, you know, one line in a whole play of just beautiful, beautiful language. Shakespeare's just wonderful. I'm a big fan. So of course this is another 5 out of 5 stars. I promise I don't give all the books I read 5 out of 5 stars, but this book is a best books list, so you are going to see a lot skew to the top. The next book on the list, coming in at number 5, is a book that I didn't rate so highly. This is another controversial opinion. And the book is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This book, I love magical realism. I'll say that first off. Gabriel Garcia Marquez is the granddaddy of magical realism, but this book just didn't do it for me. It's about the Buendia family and sort of their cyclical struggles to survive. And the biggest problem I have with this, at risk of sounding like a prude, the book has some crude sexual references. Then it has some bestiality. Then it has some incest. And then it has some pedophilia. And you know, by the time I got to the pedophilia, I'm out. For example, there's a 8-year-old girl and a grown man wants to marry her, and this is portrayed as normal and no big deal, and her parents are thrilled to marry her off to a grown man. Said, wait till she gets her period. That's the one concession they make. So she gets married while she's still playing with dolls, and her husband impregnates her immediately, and she has children and dies because she was too young to have children. That piece of it, I just couldn't get there. And that's just one of the cases of pedophilia in the book. I've read books that dealt with difficult subjects like that. For example, Lolita by Nabokov. But I felt like even in that book, where it's being written from the perspective of the pedophile themselves, I felt like it was still portrayed as this was something bad. This is something that shouldn't have happened. And in 100 Years of Solitude, I felt like it was portrayed as, this was normal and okay. And I found that really troubling. I get to some degree this was supposed to show the incestuous nature of if you're not willing to change and grow, then you kind of curve in on yourself in this unattractive, incestuous way. And in some respects, it did remind me of The Fall of the House of Usher by Poe, but I just couldn't get there at the end of the day. This was another 2-star for me. It's not completely without merit. I only give it 1 star if I feel a book is just completely without merit, but just not my cup of tea. All right, moving on to the next book. This one I read on my Kindle, mainly because it is very large, and that is Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. I really enjoyed this novel. Don't think because it has Anna Karenina in the title that that's all the book is about. Anna Karenina is also, well, first it is about Anna Karenina, a married woman. She was married very young to a much older man, and she's satisfied. Not maybe happy or fulfilled, but satisfied. And everything is fine until one day she is starstruck when she runs into a young man and falls in love with Count Bronsky is his name. And she struggles for a bit and tries to avoid him, tries not to have an affair. He pursues her. And she ends up having to make choices between her family, most notably her son that she had with her husband, and a life with Count Bronsky. And it really highlights the few options women had at the time. It also talks briefly about another man named Levin who is interested in a young girl named Kitty. I'd say theirs is a more happy relationship. And it's actually based on Tolstoy's own life and relationship with his wife, which was good at some points, although at the end of his life, not so great. And then it also deals with Anna Karenina's brother, who is just kind of a jerk. He cheats on his wife all the time. He doesn't provide her adequate funding to take care of herself and her children. And that's showing sort of the male version when a partner is not faithful, and how that leaves a woman with no choice. Throughout, like I said, the lack of choice for women is really highlighted. They say this was somewhat influenced by Tolstoy's sister, who was sort of trapped in an unhappy marriage in a similar fashion. So it's very interesting. I will say there are portions of the book I kind of wish were edited a little bit. He goes into a lot of detail about the serfs. In Russia at the time, the serfs had recently been freed, and so there was a lot of discussion about how they should be handled, how they should be treated. And there's a lot of sort of philosophical discussion there that I just didn't particularly enjoy. I don't think it's terribly relevant today. And it often kind of came off as patronizing to me. He's talking about these people almost like, what should we do with them kind of thing. And I felt it dehumanized the serfs a little bit, so I didn't like that portion. I did really love Anna Karenina. I gave it 5 stars. I would recommend. This is another author I was scared of reading just because, such a big reputation. Novels are very long. His famous ones, anyway, are very long. And I did not find him to be a difficult read. In fact, I felt that Leo Tolstoy's writing style was very similar to me to Jane Austen. Very similar. A similar sort of wit, lots of drawing room kind of social issues that are portrayed there, and very similar in style, I felt, to Jane Austen. So take that for what it's worth. The next book on the list, let's see, we're at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, is a book that I actually changed my opinion on. And that is The Stranger by Albert Camus. This is sort of an existentialist novel, kind of debating while we're all here and what's the point of life, the universe, and everything. And we follow a main character. I don't even think he's ever named. And he's just different from everyone else. Not wrong, not bad, just different. The first line of this novel is very famous, so I will read it to you if you have not heard it before. And it is, "Mother died today." Or maybe yesterday. I can't be sure. The telegram from the home says, "Your mother passed away. Funeral tomorrow. Deep sympathy." Which leaves the matter doubtful. It could have been yesterday. And throughout this book, we follow the protagonist. And one thing that I read in a review after I finished this book that I thought was really interesting is that throughout this book, you are never told the main character's motivation or feelings about anything from himself. You hear it from other people, what other people think he feels. But very, very rarely is there any sort of indication how the character himself feels. So as you read this book, if you put feelings onto the character, you're putting them there. I feel like in some ways this book acts in a little bit in the way of a mirror. I think when I'm reading that first sentence, immediately I'm thinking, well, maybe he's just shell-shocked. Maybe he doesn't know how to feel. Well, that's probably more about how I view grief than how this character views grief. And it also kind of goes into the idea of how society rejects the different. In this particular case, this main character ends up shooting a man. And he never explains, either in his internal voice or in his external voice, why he committed this murder. Just when he's asked about it, I just did it. Just did it. And everybody tries, he goes on trial for this, everybody tries to help him, give a motive. And if he had stepped forward and given a motive that everybody could understand and that was normal, then he probably wouldn't have been convicted. But that's really coming into play, his differences from the rest of society and how much they condemn him for being different. By the way, I'm not a huge fan of the cover of this book. I got it at the Friends of the Library book sale because it was 50 cents at the time. So I can put up with a not so great cover for 50 cents. But I would recommend this book. Even though I don't like a dour ending, this one stayed with me. When I first rated it, I rated it a 3. But the longer that time went by, it stuck with me and I thought about it. And I really feel it merits more of a 4. I still can't give a book that has such an unhappy ending, more than that. But it does really stick with you, and I really enjoyed it. And it's not terribly long, so if you want a short read for a modern classic, not a bad pick. All right, next. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 is Brothers Karamazov. And I have that right here. This is another big old chunky book. This one, again, is by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is a bit more of a philosophical novel. If you're trying to decide what Dostoevsky to read first, definitely go with the Crime and Punishment and not this. This is a lot more philosophical and a lot less plot-driven, although it does have a plot. In this case, we follow a man who he's just a jerk. He's a jerk pretty much according to everybody. He has almost no redeemable value. And he has 3 sons, one of which leads a spiritual life, one of which leads a very rational, logical life, and one of whom leads a very hedonistic life, searching only for his own pleasure. And while we're trying to find out who murdered the old man, the father, in this story, it's really not about that. It's really more, what is the right way to live? And the big questions are in here. What's the purpose of life? Does God exist? Now, Dostoevsky was a Christian. He did believe in God, very devoutly believed in God. However, he gives an equally great discussion of why one should be an atheist. And I think that's what makes this book so strong, is that he does give a counterpoint and a counterbalance to his own beliefs. And he does a really good job of defending the other side of the case. It's really an interesting novel. It does make you think. It is more complicated and much longer than Crime and Punishment is. I gave this a 4. I did not enjoy it as much as I enjoyed Crime and Punishment. I didn't think the ending was awesome in this, but I liked the kind of philosophical differences. I also like it more when a book speaks through the plot and through the characters to deliver its message. There were some cases in this that characters, and it's actually a part of this book that most people really love, and what they really enjoy about it is there's a point when one of the main characters really kind of gives almost a soliloquy. It's almost like you can feel him turn to the audience and start speaking to them about, especially it's the character that's justifying why he doesn't believe in God. And he's talking about that. And I just find that boring. I would rather you show me how he doesn't believe in God through the plot, instead of just having him give a speech that talks about how he doesn't believe in God. But other than that, like I said, it was great. 4 stars. Recommend to read.
Next, we turn to book number 9, and that is The Odyssey by Homer. The Odyssey is a work of epic poetry that was written almost 3,000 years ago, which I think is pretty incredible that we still read something written that long ago today and still identify with it and find something worthwhile. Homer was a poet. Most people believe he was blind. There's some dispute over whether Homer wrote this story, whether Homer just was the one who wrote this story down, despite years of oral tradition, or maybe Homer was just well known for being the orator that presented this story to the public, sort of like we might admire an actor today. Regardless, Homer is universally given the credit for this story, and it is timeless and still captivating to us today. We follow the hero Odysseus on his way back from the Peloponnesian War after suffering a lot, and he has several adventures, sort of a no rest for the weary kind of situation. And we also follow his wife Penelope back home, who's been waiting for him for 20 years, and his son, who's really never even known him. And he encounters a lot of adventures on the way. The one thing that I don't like about this book is that, women weren't treated very well in this time period, and that's evidenced here. Odysseus is not faithful to Penelope, but says he will kill her if she has not been faithful to him, even though he's been gone for 20 years. kind of crazy. But it is a kind of personal story, and it's a lot of fun. Robert Fagles is the one who wrote this edition for Penguin. Uh, I cannot imagine the anyone else doing a better job than Fagles. I can't imagine the original Greek being any more gripping than the way Fagles did this epic poetry. I will give an example from the beginning of the book just to give a feel for the beauty of the poetry that he's translated. Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course. Once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. But he could not save them from disaster, hard as he strove. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all. The blind fools, they devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god wiped from sight the day of their return. Launch out on his story, Muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time, too. I just think that that's incredible. Now, some people are very turned off by poetry, and I get it. If you are turned off by poetry, I know there are prose editions of this story out there. Go and find one of those instead and read it in a prose translation. It's still a great story, and you shouldn't let a desire against poetry to keep you from reading this book. Definitely give it a try. 5 out of 5 stars. I just think the poetry in this is beautiful. The story's entertaining, and it's just a great tale. Give it a shot.
All right, number 9 is the Arabian Nights, and specifically the list called out this particular edition. The Arabian Nights is a series of stories that was written over a very long period of time, a very long time ago, in a land far away, if you will, in several Middle Eastern countries. I like many of the stories in the Arabian Nights. There's Sinbad the Sailor, there's Aladdin, all those stories that we've heard, although many people think those are later in the span of time over which these are written. And it has what they call a frame story. So you have a young woman named Scheherazade that is the central frame story character. And what we have is we have a king who has been done dirty by his wife. So the way things were done then, he murdered her. And he's so heartbroken that he decides he's never going to trust a woman again. And he is going to marry a woman every day, and then he's going to kill her the next morning. And he's gone through quite a few women by this point. Excuse me, it's dry here today. But Scheherazade decides she's going to stop this foolishness, and she agrees to marry him even though her status would preclude her from being selected. And she marries the man, and she tells him a story on their wedding night. And she leaves it on a cliffhanger so that the next day he wants to hear the end of the story. And a lot of the stories have moral bases. So, about being a good king. And by this way, she sort of slowly but surely leads him along the garden path until she's told him stories, purportedly for 1,001 nights. At which time he decides he's not going to kill her. He is going to stay married to her and honor her above all other women. I love the frame story. I love most of the stories in this, but there are a lot of really misogynistic stories. Like there's a story about a woman who was cast out and away from her husband because she dared allow another man to kiss her on the cheek. And she was beaten and thrown out of the house for that. And that kind of stuff gets hard to read, and it appears more than once in this series of books. But again, have to remember the historical context. I will say I did knock off a point on this book because of the translation. This is translated by Sir Richard Burton, who was a fascinating character in his own right. He is, and again, I'm afraid this video is going to make me sound like a bit of a prude, because again, we have somebody who's just obsessed with sex. Sir Richard Burton really and truly was obsessed with sex. He was a very well-traveled man, the most well-traveled man of his day. He even entered Mecca pretending to be a Muslim, which is not something I advocate, but it did give him a large amount of experience. And he was obsessed with sex to such a degree, he would measure the genitals of people everywhere he went so he could compare and determine which race had large genitals and which had smaller. You can't make this stuff up. And he has a lot of just sexual references in his notes, and a lot of just really arrogant information in his notes, like, well, that information came from this translator, and he was a pile of dog doo. I don't know why anybody reads them. And I mean, it goes on, like, the notes like this long in tiny text talking about how awful these other translators are. And I just didn't enjoy that. And I think it may have colored the translation. This is obviously an adult translation. However, I will say I enjoyed this. I gave this 4 stars. I enjoyed this far less than a book I gave 5 stars, which is this version of the Arabian Nights that I read when I was a young child. My brother gave me this copy. It's got beautiful illustrations by Renee Bull. You can see the genie on the back, and it has beautiful deckled edges. And this book is held up really well. I've had this since I was a child. Other books have not been so lucky. Some pictures. This one's like beautiful. This is one of Sinbad, I believe. Yeah, this is Sinbad. And you can see some beautiful illustrations. Let's see if I can find another one. The story of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. So, I really enjoyed this. I enjoyed the stories that were selected, and it was a good time. Whereas the other version, again, more geared towards adults. This is just a lot more fun, lighthearted versions of the Arabian Nights stories. And it doesn't tell me who translated these, or I would mention it. All right. That is all 10 books that are supposed to be the best books of all time. What do you think? Would you have included these books on the list? Would you have included different books? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. As always, like, subscribe, and click that bell. Thanks again. Bye.